"Show me the Varath Gorge footage again," Commander Tessock said, and the room went quiet. Not the quiet of compliance. The quiet of officers who had already watched the footage 4 times and did not want to watch it a 5th. Lieutenant Kesara's hand hesitated over the projection interface. Sub-Commander Dreven, seated at the far end of the briefing table, pressed his mandibles together so tightly that the cartilage clicked. The 7 other officers of the Dominion's 9th Expeditionary Command sat in their curved chairs and said nothing. But Tessock could read every one of them the way he read terrain. The microshifts in posture, the refusal to make eye contact, the careful stillness that career soldiers adopted when they were processing something they did not yet have language for. Tessock leaned forward. "Play it." Kesara tapped the interface. The holographic display above the briefing table bloomed with amber light, and the Varath Gorge materialized in 3 dimensions: a narrow canyon on the southern continent of Rithai's IV, rust-colored walls rising 40 meters on either side, the floor a broken field of basalt and scrub vegetation. Time stamp: Day 14, 3:42 local. 14 days into what the Dominion Strategic Bureau had designated Operation Quiet Tide. 14 days into what Tessock had been told would be a routine suppression of a human colonial outpost with a population of 312 civilians and a security detail of 19. He had brought 800. On the display, a column of Dominion ground troops moved through the gorge in standard low-light formation. Tessock recognized the unit, 3rd Cohort, 2nd Battalion under Captain Morek. 60 soldiers in full combat harness, thermal optics engaged, weapon systems linked to the battalion's tactical net. They moved well. Spacing was textbook. Point teams swept the walls with active sensors. Rear guard maintained a rotating watch cycle. They were disciplined, experienced, and alert. "Freeze at 3:47, Tessock said. The image stopped. The column had reached a bend in the gorge where the canyon walls pinched inward. At the narrowest point, the passage was perhaps 6 meters wide. Standard doctrine called for a halt and sensor sweep before committing to a choke point. Morek had followed doctrine. The point team was arrayed at the mouth of the narrows, sensor returns painting green across the display. All clear. No heat signatures, no motion, no electromagnetic anomalies. The gorge ahead was empty. "Resume." The column moved forward, into the narrows. Tessock watched his officers' faces as the footage played. He had memorized every second of it, but he watched them instead. Watched the way Dreven's crest flattened against his skull, watched Lieutenant Hareth's fingers tighten on the table's edge, watched the youngest officer in the room, Ensign Peleth, swallow convulsively as the first marker appeared. It was a rock, a piece of basalt roughly the size of a closed fist, placed on a ledge at eye level on the eastern wall of the gorge. It should not have been remarkable. The gorge was full of rocks, but this one had been placed. Not fallen, not tumbled. Placed with the flat face outward at a height and position that made it visible to anyone walking through the narrows. Point specialist Vren was the first to notice it. The footage showed him pausing, tilting his head, reaching up to touch the stone. "He reported it," Tessock said to the room. Vren logged the anomaly at 3:49. He described it as a possible trail marker. Captain Morek acknowledged the report and ordered the column to continue. "Standard assessment, mineral debris, no threat. Correct." The officers said nothing. They knew what came next. "That rock was the first of 9, Tessock said. Spaced at intervals through the narrows, each one placed at a different height, a different angle. 9 rocks. The tactical AI processed all 9 and classified them as geological scatter with a 91% confidence rating." He paused. The human who placed them was sitting 14 meters above the column on a ledge that our thermal optics could not resolve, because she had packed herself in mud from the canyon floor. River clay, the same temperature as the surrounding basalt. She watched 60 of my soldiers walk beneath her, and she placed those rocks to tell us something. "Tell us what?" Ensign Peleth asked. His voice was thin. Tessock looked at him, that she had been there first. He let the footage play. At 3:58, the column cleared the narrows and entered a wider section of the gorge. The formation expanded back to standard spacing. Marek ordered a brief halt for a hydration cycle. Soldiers took positions along the walls, weapons across their laps, thermal optics scanning in lazy sweeps. At 4:01, Private Disick, rear guard, 3rd rotation, reported that his ammunition counter was reading 2 rounds fewer than his last check. He had not fired. His weapons log showed no discharge. The safety had been engaged since the column entered the gorge. But 2 rounds were missing from his magazine. The magazine had been in his weapon, and the weapon had been on his person for the entire transit. She took the rounds while we were moving, Tessock said. From a loaded weapon on a soldier's body in a column of 60, in the dark, without being seen, heard, or felt. That is not possible, Drevin said. It was the 5th time he had said it. Each time his voice carried less conviction. Private Disick's weapon log confirms no discharge and no magazine release. The maintenance seal on his magazine housing was intact. She did not remove the magazine. She reached into the ejection port and extracted 2 rounds from the feed mechanism, one at a time by hand, while Disick was walking. The room absorbed this. Tessock gave them 3 seconds, then moved on. At 4:03, Marek ordered a security check, full weapons inspection. The results came back across the tactical net over the next 4 minutes. 11 soldiers in the column reported discrepancies. 7 had ammunition counts that did not match their logs. 2 had their secondary sidearms power cells drained to 0, cells that had been at full charge at the start of the patrol. 1 had his communication relay reconfigured to broadcast on an open frequency. And Corporal Thesick, the column's medic, found that every one of his 18 sedation cartridges had been replaced with empty casings packed with canyon mud. Tessock let the silence hold. Marek pulled the column into a defensive formation and requested air support. Battalion command denied the request. They had no air assets available. Every drone in the operational theater had been grounded 6 hours earlier. Their navigation systems had developed what the technical staff described as a persistent offset error. Every drone was reporting its position as 200 meters east of its actual location. The error had been introduced through a firmware vulnerability that the Dominion's Cybersecurity Division did not know existed. A human colonial security officer compromised military-grade navigation firmware, Kesara said. Not an officer, Tessock said. We confirmed identities later. The individual responsible for the drone compromise was a 26-year-old woman named Jessa Corvin. Her official file listed her as a hydroponic systems technician. She had no military training, no intelligence background, no cybersecurity credentials. She grew vegetables. He stood and walked to the holographic display. The Verath Gorge rotated slowly above the table, amber and shadow. I want to go back, he said. Before the gorge, before Marek's column, I want to talk about what this operation was supposed to be. He tapped the display and the gorge dissolved, replaced by a tactical overview of Rithai's IV, a temperate world with 2 major continents, extensive river systems, and a human colonial settlement called Threshold on the western shore of the southern continent. 312 civilians. A prefabricated town with agricultural plots, a small medical clinic, a school, a community hall, and a perimeter fence that the strategic assessment described as adequate for local wildlife deterrence. The security detail consisted of 19 individuals, 12 men and 7 women, ages 22 to 58, armed with standard colonial sidearms and 3 hunting rifles. 800 Dominion soldiers, 4 combat shuttles, a light cruiser in orbit providing sensor coverage and communications relay. The operation's objectives were straightforward: secure the settlement, detain the population for processing, and establish a forward garrison as part of the Dominion's expansion into the Rethais corridor. The Strategic Bureau's threat assessment rated Threshold as a Category 2, minimal resistance expected, Tesok said. I reviewed the assessment personally. I agreed with it. The settlement had no military infrastructure, no fortifications beyond the perimeter fence, no heavy weapons, no shielding, no orbital defense capability. 19 security personnel with sidearms against 800 professional soldiers. He paused. On day 1, we landed 3 kilometers north of the settlement in standard deployment formation. 4 platoons in the first wave, establishing a perimeter. The rest of the force in reserve aboard the shuttles. Textbook. By the time the first platoon reached the settlement's northern fence line, the town was empty. Empty, Harith repeated. Every structure cleared. Personal belongings left in place, meals on tables, children's toys on floors, medical equipment still running in the clinic. But every human was gone. 312 people, including children, elderly, and a woman who had given birth 4 days earlier. Gone. In the 90 minutes between our orbital insertion and our arrival at the fence. The settlement's transport consisted of 6 ground vehicles and 2 cargo haulers. All 6 ground vehicles were still in their charging bays. Both cargo haulers were parked at the agricultural depot. They did not use vehicles. They walked into the southern highland on foot, carrying what they could, and they did it in 90 minutes without leaving a trail that our sensors could follow. The terrain south of the settlement is open grassland for 12 kilometers, Drevin said. Our orbital sensors should have tracked them. They should have. The cruiser's sensor officer reported clear returns across the entire southern approach. No heat signatures, no motion, no disturbance patterns in the vegetation. Nothing. 312 humans crossed 12 kilometers of open ground in daylight, and our orbital platform did not see them. How? Tesok shook his head slowly. We found out later. They moved through the irrigation channels. The settlement's agricultural system included a network of subsurface water channels, hand-dug, no larger than a meter in diameter, extending south from the crop fields into the highland watershed. They were not on our survey maps because they were not infrastructure. They were ditches. The kind of thing a farmer digs with a shovel over the course of a few seasons. Our sensors were calibrated for structures, vehicles, and biological heat signatures on the surface. The humans were a meter underground, in muddy water, crawling through channels that our mapping drones had classified as drainage features. A woman who had given birth 4 days earlier, Kesara said softly. She crawled through a drainage ditch for 12 kilometers carrying her infant on her chest, Tesok confirmed. When the Dominion medical team examined her after the withdrawal, she showed no injuries from the transit, minor abrasions, mild dehydration. The infant was healthy. She had wrapped the child in a waterproof membrane made from crop packaging material and held it above the water line for the entire crawl. When asked about the experience during the post-withdrawal interview, she described it as, quote, "Not the worst day I have had with a newborn." He returned to his chair and sat down. The settlement's security chief was a man named Tobias Rent, 58 years old, former mining foreman from a colony called Duval's Reach. No military record, no combat experience listed in any database we could access. He had a bad knee, a hearing aid in his left ear, and he walked with a slight limp. When we pulled his colonial registration file, his listed skills were heavy equipment operation, structural engineering, and community mediation. Tesok leaned back. Tobias Rent is the most dangerous individual I have ever encountered. And I have fought the Veshan Hive commanders and the Prelian shock cavalry. None of them did what Rent did to 800 of my soldiers over 21 days. The officers shifted. Tesok could feel their discomfort like heat radiating from armor plating left in the sun. Let me walk you through it. Day 1, settlement empty. I ordered a full search. Nothing. Day 2, I established a garrison in the settlement and sent reconnaissance south toward the highland. 4 patrols, 16 soldiers each, covering the cardinal approaches. All 4 patrols returned by nightfall without contact. No sign of the colonists. No trails, no camps, no refuse, no thermal signatures. Day 3, first contact. Not with weapons, with a message. He tapped the display. An image appeared, a section of stone wall on the northern face of a highland ridge, roughly 2 kilometers south of the settlement. Scratched into the rock with a sharp tool were 4 words in Dominion trade script. "We see your patrols." "They learned our written language," Peleth said. Rent had been the settlement's liaison with Dominion trade convoys for 3 years. He spoke conversational Dominion. He read our trade script. He had learned it in order to negotiate grain prices. Tessock advanced the display. A second image, another rock face, this one 3 kilometers east, found by a patrol on day 4. "Your eastern camp uses too much water. The stream feeds our crops. Move it." They were tracking our movements. Every patrol, every camp, every supply route. And they were communicating with us. Not threats, instructions, observations. They were telling us where we were wasting resources, where our positions were exposed, where our routines had become predictable, as if they were reviewing our operational posture and finding it insufficient. Day 5. We found the first snare. Not a weapon, a trap designed for the local wildlife, a burrowing herbivore the colonists called a digger. The snare was set on a game trail 200 meters from our eastern camp. Nothing unusual about a snare in a colony's agricultural zone, except this one was rigged with a transponder that was broadcasting on our encrypted command frequency. When a soldier approached the snare, the transponder pinged the tactical net with a data packet that contained the soldier's identification number, his unit designation, and his current ammunition load. "They had access to our tactical network," Drevin said. "No, they had access to the passive emissions from our equipment. Every soldier in the Dominion carries a personal identification transponder embedded in their combat harness. The transponder broadcasts a low-power signal that the tactical net uses for force tracking. The broadcast is encrypted, but the encryption key is generated from a seed value that is printed, physically printed, in machine-readable code on the transponder's housing, inside the harness, where no one would normally see it. Rent saw it. During 3 years of trade liaison work, he had been in our supply depots. He had stood next to soldiers. He had watched technicians perform field maintenance on combat harnesses. At some point, he memorized a key seed. One seed. And from that one seed, a woman who grew vegetables built a transponder that could read our entire force tracking network. Tessock stood again. He could not stay seated when he talked about this. The restlessness was not nervousness. It was something closer to the feeling he had in the field when the tactical picture was changing faster than his staff could process. The need to move, to act, to close the gap between what he knew and what was happening. Day 6 through day 9, the snares multiplied. Not traps in the combat sense, information-gathering devices. We found them on game trails, in stream beds, hanging from tree branches, buried under loose soil near our patrol routes. Each one was built from scavenged materials, wire from the settlement's fence, circuit boards from agricultural sensors, power cells from children's toys. Each one was calibrated to capture a different type of data, motion patterns, radio frequency emissions. Bootprint depth analysis. They were measuring how much weight each soldier carried by the depth of their tracks in soft ground. He looked at each officer in turn. On day 6, Lieutenant Voss in the western sector reported a peculiar finding during his morning patrol debrief. Every one of his 12 soldiers had been marked. Not with paint or dye, nothing visible to the naked eye. A phosphorescent compound, derived from the bioluminescent moss that grows along the highland stream banks, had been applied to the dorsal plate of each soldier's combat harness. A single thumbprint, precise, centered, applied to the one section of the harness that the wearer cannot see or reach without removing the entire rig. Voss's soldiers had been walking for 6 hours with a human thumbprint on their backs, and none of them knew it until a maintenance technician noticed the glow under ultraviolet light during the standard end-of-day equipment check. 12 soldiers, 12 thumbprints, 1 patrol. That means someone touched all 12 of them at close range during a 6-hour patrol in open terrain, without being detected by any of them. He let the arithmetic speak for itself. Day 7. The corrected drones went up at 600, full-spectrum sweep of the Highland. Every sensor mode we had: thermal, electromagnetic, acoustic, ground penetration radar. The drones flew grid patterns for 14 hours. They covered the entire search area twice. Total contacts, 407, all classified as indigenous wildlife. No human signatures. At 1900, after the drones had been recovered, our technical section performed a routine data review. Analyst Kesoth, no relation to the species, it is a common Dominion name, flagged an anomaly in the acoustic data. At 11 separate points during the drone survey, the acoustic sensors had recorded a sound pattern that did not match any known wildlife vocalization. The pattern was rhythmic, 3 short pulses, 1 long, repeated at irregular intervals. Kesoth ran the pattern through the Signal Intelligence database. No matches. He ran it through the Xenolinguistic Archive. No matches. He flagged it as unknown and forwarded it to my intelligence section. 2 weeks later, after the withdrawal, a Dominion communications specialist identified the pattern. It was Terran Morse code. The letter V, 3 short, 1 long. It is a human cultural reference, a symbol of defiance or of victory. The colonists had been signaling to each other, using their own voices, at a frequency and cadence that mimicked the rhythmic patterns of local insect life. Our drones heard them. Our analysts classified the sound as background fauna, because the humans had studied the local ecosystem well enough to know exactly what their voices needed to sound like to pass as native wildlife. Day 8. My intelligence section produced a report recommending an escalation to active search and detain operations. I approved it. We deployed tracking teams, 6 4-man squads trained in pursuit operations, equipped with ground-penetrating sensors, biological trace analyzers, and scent tracking equipment calibrated for human chemical signatures. The tracking teams spread into the Highland at dawn. By midday, 3 of the 6 teams had reported that their scent tracking equipment was malfunctioning. The biological trace analyzers were returning constant positive readings in every direction, as if the entire Highland was saturated with human chemical signature. Investigation revealed that it was. The colonists had distributed items of worn clothing, shirts, socks, head coverings, across hundreds of locations in the Highland, under rocks, in tree hollows, stuffed into crevices, draped across bushes. Every item carried concentrated human scent. The tracking equipment could not differentiate between a real human and a sweat-soaked shirt wedged into a rock formation. The Highland smelled like 300 humans were everywhere at once. The remaining 3 tracking teams followed a genuine-looking trail to the central ridge. At 1400, the lead team found a campsite, warm coals, fresh boot prints, food scraps. They converged 3 squads on the position. The campsite was a fabrication. The coals were tended remotely by timing fuse. The boot prints were pressed into soil using a carved wooden block shaped to replicate Dominion military boot treads. They had built a fake camp, using our own boot pattern to make us chase ourselves. He looked at each officer in turn. By day 9, Tobias Rent knew more about my force than my own intelligence section did. He knew our patrol schedules, our rest cycles, our supply consumption rates, our communication protocols, our equipment maintenance intervals, and the physical conditioning profile of every unit in the field. He knew which platoons were sharp and which were tired. He knew which officers checked their perimeters personally and which delegated. He knew the name of every squad leader in the eastern sector because his people had been close enough to hear them talking. Close enough to hear, Kesara echoed. We never saw them, not once in 9 days. 312 civilians, including children, living somewhere in the highlands south of a town that 800 soldiers were using as a base, and we could not find them. Our orbital sensors found nothing. Our ground patrols found nothing. Our drones, when we finally corrected the navigation error on day 7, found nothing. Our tracking teams found only what the colonists wanted them to find. The highland is rough terrain, rocky, with extensive cave networks and dense scrub vegetation, but it is not vast. The search area was roughly 40 square kilometers. We had the manpower. We had the technology. We had orbital coverage. We found nothing. And I want to be precise about what nothing felt like, Tessock said, because the operational reports do not capture it. Nothing in this context was not an absence. It was a presence. Every soldier in my command felt watched, not paranoid, not imagining things, watched because they were. The humans were there, always. Within visual range, within earshot, sometimes within arm's reach. And the knowledge that they were there, combined with the absolute inability to see them, detect them, or predict them, produced an effect that my chief medical officer described in his Day 9 report as pervasive situational dread. Soldiers stopped talking at night, not by order, by instinct. They stopped because they had internalized the idea that every word they spoke was being heard, processed, and used. Patrol discipline, paradoxically, deteriorated not from carelessness but from hypervigilance. Soldiers were spending so much cognitive energy scanning for threats that were not there, or rather, were there but invisible, that they were missing routine procedural steps. Weapons maintenance dropped. Sleep quality cratered. 2 soldiers in the eastern sector requested transfer. One of them, a decorated sergeant with 14 years of service, told his platoon commander that he would rather face a Veshan hive assault than spend another night in a place where someone could touch his weapon without him knowing it. Day 10, the demonstrations began. He used the word deliberately and watched it register. Demonstrations, not attacks, not raids, not ambushes, demonstrations. At 200, the garrison's perimeter alarm triggered on the southern fence. The duty platoon deployed to the breach point in standard response formation. They found no breach. The alarm had been triggered by a bundle of dried grass tied to the fence wire with a length of string. The string led across 20 meters of open ground to a second bundle, which led to a third, which led to a fourth. The trail of bundles circled the garrison's entire southern perimeter and terminated at the main gate, where a small pile of the ammunition rounds stolen from our soldiers' weapons over the preceding days had been arranged in a neat pattern on the ground. What pattern? Harith asked. A smiley face, Tessock said, one of the human cultural symbols for friendliness. Nobody laughed. Tessock had not expected them to. Day 11. Sergeant Marek's platoon, the same unit that would later enter the gorge, was conducting a routine patrol along the western ridge. At 1400, Marek halted the platoon for a rest period. The soldiers sat on the ridge, removed their helmets, drank water, ate rations. Standard. When they stood to resume the patrol, Private Hennick discovered that the unit's identification pennant, the cloth insignia carried on a pole at the column's center, had been replaced. Our pennant was gone. In its place was a hand-sewn replica using local plant fiber. The replica was accurate in every detail except one. The Dominion crest at the center had been replaced with a small embroidered flower. A local wildflower. The stitching was precise, clean, and even. Someone approached a platoon at rest, removed the unit pennant, replaced it with a forgery, and left, Drevin said, while soldiers were sitting and watching. While soldiers were sitting and watching, Tessock confirmed. None of them saw anything. Marek checked the approach angles afterward. The ridge had clear sightlines for 300 meters in every direction. There was no concealment, no cover, nothing but open rock and sparse scrub. and someone walked up to the center of a resting platoon, performed a close-quarters manipulation of equipment, and left. In daylight. He advanced to Day 13. Day 13. A supply shuttle arrived from the cruiser carrying provisions, equipment, and replacement power cells. The shuttle landed on the garrison's designated pad, the supplies were offloaded, and the shuttle departed. Standard resupply. Nothing unusual. 6 hours later, the quartermaster discovered that every container of rations in the shipment had been opened, inspected, resealed, and labeled with handwritten annotations in Dominion trade script. The annotations were nutritional assessments: caloric content, mineral balance, vitamin profiles. Each label included a recommendation. Your troops need more iron. This ration is adequate. This one is not. Substitute fresh protein if available. Your Eastern platoon shows signs of fatigue. Increase caloric intake by 15%. They evaluated our food supply, Peleth said. They evaluated our food supply and left recommendations for improving it. While the shipment was sitting on a guarded landing pad inside a garrison perimeter, Tessock could see the pattern registering across his officers' faces, the slow accumulation of incidents building toward a conclusion that none of them wanted to reach. Each demonstration was individually improbable. Together, they formed a picture that was not improbable at all. It was inevitable. The picture said, "We are everywhere. We see everything. We can reach anything. And we mean you no harm." Day 14, the Gorge. He returned the display to the Verath Gorge footage. The column, the rocks, the stolen ammunition, the replaced sedation cartridges. After the weapons check, Morik held the column in place for 40 minutes while he requested instructions. I told him to proceed to the objective, a ridge overlook where our intelligence suggested the colonists might have an observation post. Morik reformed the column and advanced. At 4:12, the column's sensor array registered a sound. The footage's audio enhancement played through the briefing room speakers, low, rhythmic, coming from above and behind. A human voice. Someone was whistling. A simple melody, 3 notes repeated, drifting down from the canyon walls like rain. Morik ordered his column to hold position and scan the walls. Thermal sweep, acoustic triangulation, active sensor pulse. Results: negative. The whistling continued for approximately 90 seconds, moving along the eastern rim of the gorge from south to north. Morik dispatched a 4-soldier team to scale the eastern wall. They reached the rim in 8 minutes. The rim was empty. The whistling had stopped. While the 4 soldiers were climbing, the remaining 56 in the gorge experienced the following. The column's rear guard reported that his bootlaces had been tied together, not loosely, in a knot that the duty sergeant later described as a standard maritime hitch requiring 2 hands and approximately 4 seconds to execute. The soldier had been standing upright, weapon raised, scanning the western wall. He had not felt a thing. The whistling was misdirection, Tessock said. 3 individuals at different positions along the rim, creating a moving sound source that pulled every sensor and every pair of eyes in the column toward the eastern wall. While they looked east, someone came in low from the west. Who? Drevin asked. Tessock brought up a post-operation image. A woman's face, weathered calm, with deep lines around the eyes and a thin scar across the bridge of her nose. She was looking directly at the camera with an expression that Tessock had spent a long time studying. It was not defiance. It was not mockery. It was the patient, evaluating gaze of someone who was accustomed to watching things carefully and drawing conclusions. Myra Sarin, 41 years old, threshold school teacher. She taught children ages 5 through 12. Mathematics, reading, natural sciences. She had no military background. Before coming to Rathai's IV, she was a librarian on a colony called New Thessaly. He let that settle. The schoolteacher tied a soldier's boots together while he was standing in a combat formation. She did it to demonstrate a capability, not to harm, to educate. The word hung in the room. Tessock let it stay. Every action they took in 21 days followed the same principle. They never harmed anyone, not once. Not a single casualty. They disarmed, misdirected, observed, and communicated. They removed ammunition from weapons. They drained power cells. They reprogrammed drones. They left messages. They tied bootlaces and replaced sedation cartridges with mud and annotated our rations with nutritional advice. They did everything in their power to make us understand that they could reach us, touch us, affect us at will, and they did not hurt us. He walked to the display and pulled up a timeline. 21 days of operational entries, color-coded by type. The blue entries were Dominion actions, patrols, searches, redeployments, equipment checks. The amber entries were human actions, each one a contact, a message, a demonstration. The amber entries outnumbered the blue nearly 3-1. Day 15. At 600, the garrison's morning watch reported that every sentry post on the perimeter, all 12 of them, had been visited during the night. At each post, someone had left a small gift, a bundle of edible berries, a hand-carved wooden bird, a pendant made from a river stone, dried meat seasoned with wild herbs. Each gift was personalized. The sentry who foraged berries received berries. The one who had described local birdlife received the carving. The female sentry received an ornament in her species' cultural style. 12 sentries, 12 gifts, each chosen based on behavioral observation the colonists could only have gathered through sustained close-range study. One of them, Private Kashur at Post 7, found his gift sitting on top of his weapon, while it was in his hands. On day 16, I ordered a full battalion sweep of the highland. 400 soldiers in a search line, shoulder to shoulder, moving south at walking pace. We covered 19 square kilometers in 6 hours. We found 47 message stones, 11 snare devices, a cache of ammunition that had been removed from our soldiers' weapons over the preceding days, sorted by caliber and stacked neatly in a dry cave, and a handwritten note in Dominion trade script. He recited the note from memory. He had read it so many times that the words had become a kind of landscape in his mind, something he walked through rather than across. The note said, "Commander Tessock, your soldiers are tired. Your eastern flank is understaffed by approximately 30% since you redeployed 2nd Platoon to the northern perimeter. Your supply shuttle is overdue by 9 hours, which means your cruiser has diverted to another tasking. Your communication relay has a range gap between frequencies 7 and 9 that we have been using for local coordination. We have no quarrel with your soldiers. We would like to discuss terms. Leave a light on in the community hall tonight if you are willing to talk. T. Rent." The silence in the briefing room was absolute. Tessock could hear the ventilation system cycling air through the overhead ducts, a sound he had never noticed before. "Every fact in that note was accurate," Tessock said. "The eastern flank was understaffed. The supply shuttle was overdue. The frequency gap existed. He knew my name. He had been watching my command post. He had been close enough to read the unit markings on my shuttle and the rank insignia on my officers' uniforms. And he had timed the delivery of the note to coincide with the moment when my force was most extended, most fatigued, and most psychologically receptive to the idea that continuing the operation was futile." "You left the light on," Harith said, "not a question." "I left the light on. And Rent came. Rent came, alone, unarmed. He walked through our perimeter at 2100 on day 16, approached the community hall, knocked on the door, and sat down across from me at a table where I had 2 armed guards and a sidearm within reach. He looked at the guards, then at me, and the first thing he said was, "Your south guard is asleep. I walked past him. You might want to rotate him out." He was correct. I had the guard replaced. Tessock sat down. The exhaustion was not physical. It was the exhaustion of a man who has been forced to rewrite his understanding of his own profession. We talked for 3 hours. The full conversation is in the classified record. I will tell you the parts that matter. The first thing I noticed was the way he sat. He took the chair across from me and placed his hands flat on the table, fingers spread, palms down. It was a gesture I recognized. I had been trained in Dominion diplomatic protocol, and placing your hands flat on a table is the Dominion signal for I am unarmed and open. He was using our body language, not his, ours. He had learned it from watching trade convoy officers negotiate grain shipments. The second thing I noticed was his eyes. They moved constantly, not nervously, methodically. When I spoke, he watched my face. When I paused, his gaze swept the room. He cataloged the guards' positions, the location of every exit, the angle of the overhead lighting, the distance to the window, the type of sidearm I wore, and the position of the data pad on the table. I know this because 20 minutes into the conversation, I tested him. I asked what was behind him. Without turning around, he described the room accurately. 2 guards, both holding their weapons at a 45-degree rest angle, the one on the left slightly more tense than the one on the right, a ventilation grill in the ceiling 11 centimeters off-center from the room's midline, and a crack in the plaster above the eastern window that ran diagonally for approximately 30 centimeters. He had been in the room for 20 minutes and he had already built a complete spatial map, including structural details that I, who had been using the room as my command post for 2 weeks, had never noticed. I asked him how he did that. He looked puzzled. He said, "Did what?" He genuinely did not understand the question. To him, cataloging a room's details was not a skill. It was breathing. It was what his eyes did when they were open. He looked at the officers. Every one of them was still. I asked Rent how 19 security personnel and 300 civilians had neutralized 800 professional soldiers without firing a single shot. He corrected me. He said it was not 19 security personnel. It was 312 people, including the children. The children, Peleth whispered. The children ran messages. Through the irrigation channels, through the cave networks, through paths in the brush that were too small for an adult but perfectly sized for a 10-year-old. They carried notes, food, water, and signal devices. They operated in pairs, moving at night, using routes they had mapped by playing in the highland for years before we ever arrived. Rent said the children were his most reliable couriers because they were fearless in terrain that adults treated with caution, and because their pattern recognition was, in his words, uncontaminated by assumption. Uncontaminated by assumption, Drevin repeated. A child does not see a gorge and think choke point. A child sees a gorge and thinks, where can I climb? A child does not see a patrol and think threat. A child sees a patrol and thinks, how close can I get before they notice me? They turned the highland into a game. And they were better at the game than we were because they had been playing it their entire lives. Tessock looked at the timeline on the display, 21 days of amber dots. I asked Rent how his people had remained invisible to orbital surveillance. He said they had not been invisible. They had been misidentified. Our orbital sensors were calibrated to flag human-scale heat signatures moving in organized patterns, columns, groups, formations. The colonists never moved in groups larger than 3. They moved individually or in pairs, on routes that followed animal trails, stream beds, and geological features that produced their own thermal signatures. Our sensor AI classified them as wildlife because they moved like wildlife. Because 3 million years of evolutionary heritage had taught them to move like the thing they hunted. He said something else that I have not been able to stop thinking about, Tessock continued. He said, Commander, your soldiers are trained to see threats. My people are trained by ancestry, not by drill, to see everything. A threat is just one of the things we notice. We also notice the way the grass bends when someone walked through it 3 hours ago. We notice the moisture pattern on a rock that tells us which direction the wind was blowing at dawn. We notice the pitch of an engine from 4 kilometers away and can tell you whether it is idling, accelerating, or carrying a load. Your soldiers are looking for us. We are looking at everything. That is the difference." He paused. I asked Rent one final question before he left the community hall that night. I asked him what would have happened if I had ordered my soldiers to use lethal force. The room waited. Rent looked at me for a long time. His expression did not change. His bad knee was propped on a supply crate. His hearing aid caught the light from the overhead panel. He looked like someone's grandfather. Then he said, "Commander, if you had used lethal force, we would have responded in kind. And I say this with no pleasure and no threat. If this had become a killing operation, your casualties would have been total. Not because we are stronger than your soldiers, because we would have seen them first. Every time, in every engagement, in every terrain. At every hour, we would have seen them first, and in combat, the side that sees first is the side that survives. I have spent 21 days proving to you that we see first. I am asking you to believe me so that no one has to die proving it again." He told me something else, Tessock said, something that kept me awake for the next 3 nights. He said, "Commander, I have identified 47 soldiers in your command who are showing behavioral markers of high stress, fatigue, or emotional distress." And then he described each one, not by name, by behavior. The private in the northern sector who had stopped eating breakfast. The sergeant in Morek's platoon who checked her weapon compulsively, 3 times per hour, every hour, because she could not shake the feeling that the magazine count was wrong. The lieutenant who walked the eastern perimeter at 300 every night and stood looking south for exactly 4 minutes before returning to his quarters. The corporal who had started humming to himself on patrol, a nervous habit, rhythmic, unconscious, and did not know he was broadcasting his position to anyone within 300 meters. Rent had built a psychological profile of my entire force through direct observation, and he was sharing it with me because he was genuinely concerned about my soldiers' welfare. For each one, he prescribed a specific intervention. Give the insomniac a communication channel so he can talk to whoever he is thinking about. Tell the one who stopped eating that she is doing well. Give the compulsive weapon checker a task that uses his hands, something to build, because the weapon is the only variable he can control, and he knows it will not help him. A mining foreman with a bad knee and a hearing aid was prescribing mental health interventions for my soldiers based on behavioral observation from concealment. And every recommendation, when I checked it against my chief medical officer's notes, was accurate. Tessock paused. The briefing room was absolutely silent. He could hear the officers breathing, some of them shallow, some of them held. "That was the moment I understood what we were dealing with," he said. "Not the ammunition, not the drones, not the bootlaces or the pennant or the annotated rations. Those were demonstrations of access proof that they could reach us. The psychological profiles were something else. They were proof that the humans were not just watching us. They were reading us. The way a doctor reads a patient. The way a predator reads prey. With the same attentive, sustained, analytical focus, and with the same fundamental question underlying every observation: what does this one need? In a predator, that question is, how do I take this one down? In Rent, the question was, how do I keep this one intact? The cognitive architecture was identical. The intent was opposite. And I do not know which version is more frightening. He paused, looked toward the briefing room doorway. "There is someone here who can explain this better than I can. Dr. Vasek." From the corridor, a human woman stepped into the room. Perhaps 35, lean, sun-darkened skin, short-cropped hair. Plain gray jumpsuit, no insignia, standard issue for civilian consultants. She looked at the room full of Dominion officers the way someone might look at a familiar landscape, taking it in, noting the details. "Dr. Lena Vasek, Dominion Xenological Advisory Panel," Tessock said, "the only human on the staff." Vasek sat in the chair Tessock indicated. She moved with the natural economy of someone who had never learned to waste motion. I have been standing in the corridor for 22 minutes, she said. Since before the briefing started, I watched each of you enter the room. I watched you choose your seats. I watched you read the briefing agenda on your data pads. None of you noticed me. The officers looked at each other. That is the trait, Vasek said simply. Not in its extreme form. I am not Rent, I am not Soren, I am not a colonial survival specialist. I am a xenologist with a desk assignment. And I was 4 meters from an open doorway in a well-lit corridor for 22 minutes while 9 trained military officers walked past me. I was not hiding. I was standing still and watching. Humans are very good at standing still and watching. It is, in evolutionary terms, the only thing we have ever been truly exceptional at. Dreven's crest had flattened completely against his skull. Explain. Vasek folded her hands on the table. She spoke with the measured cadence of someone who had explained this before and expected to explain it many times more. Humans are pursuit predators. It is what we evolved to do. Before we had weapons, before we had tools, before we had language, we tracked. We followed prey across open savanna for hours, sometimes days, reading the ground, the air, the behavior of the animal, the pattern of its movement. We read broken grass and disturbed soil and the direction of wind-carried scent. We read the sky for weather and the stars for navigation and the faces of our companions for intent. Our brains dedicate more processing capacity to pattern recognition than to any other cognitive function. We do it constantly. We do it in our sleep. We cannot turn it off. She looked at Dreven. When your soldiers walked through the Varath Gorge, every human watching them was reading everything. Boot cadence, which soldiers were confident and which were nervous. Weapon handling, who checked their sights and who did not. Eye movement patterns, who scanned the walls systematically and who looked where the person ahead of them looked. Breathing rates, audible through the canyon's acoustics. The specific way each soldier's armor creaked when they turned, which told our people the exact range of motion each individual had in their harness and where their blind spots were. She paused. Your soldiers were walking through the gorge. The humans were reading the gorge, reading your soldiers and reading the tactical situation simultaneously, without instruments. They were doing it with the same cognitive systems that their ancestors used to track antelope on the African plains, and they were doing it with the same unconscious fluency. The gorge was not a transit route to them. It was a text, and they could read every line. Vasek nodded. There is a term in human behavioral science, Umwelt. It means the perceptual world that a species inhabits. Every species sees a different version of reality, filtered through its evolved senses. Your soldiers' Umwelt is technological. They perceive the world through instruments, through data feeds, through sensor returns on screens. The colonists' Umwelt was biological. They perceived the world through direct observation. Eyes, ears, skin, smell, the pressure of air against the face, the vibration of ground through boot soles, the taste of moisture in the wind. These two Umwelts were operating in the same physical space but seeing entirely different things. Your soldiers saw a highland with no thermal contacts. The colonists saw 800 individuals broadcasting their position through every footstep, every radio emission, every breath. She looked around the table. Commander Tesok asked me to attend this briefing because the operational reports do not capture what happened on Rithai's IV. The reports describe events, stolen ammunition, compromised drones, replaced pennants. What they do not describe is the underlying cognitive disparity. Your soldiers were operating at the level of their technology. The colonists were operating at the level of their biology. And in an environment where technology can be compromised, jammed, misdirected, or spoofed, biology is the system that cannot be turned off. Tesok looked at the display. The timeline glowed amber against the dark background of the briefing room. The Dominion withdrew from Rithai's IV on day 22, he said. I filed the withdrawal recommendation personally. It was approved by Strategic Bureau within 6 hours. which tells me that someone in the Bureau's analytical division had already reached the same conclusion I had. But I want to tell you about the withdrawal itself, because it is the part that stays with me. On day 22, as our shuttles loaded personnel and equipment for extraction, the colonists emerged from the highland. All of them. 312 people walking down from the southern ridge in broad daylight in a loose column with Rent at the front and the children running ahead. They had been living in a network of interconnected caves and brush shelters for 21 days. They were thin. Some of them were sunburned. Several of the older colonists were moving stiffly, and the woman with the newborn was carrying the child in a sling made from her own jacket. But they were organized. They were calm. And they walked directly to the garrison, as if they were coming home from a day's work. Rent approached me at the landing pad. He extended his hand, the human greeting gesture. I took it. His grip was firm, his palm calloused, and his fingers were steadier than mine. He said, "Thank you for listening, Commander. Most people do not." Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced my unit's identification pennant, the original, the one that Soren had replaced with the embroidered replica on day 11. It was clean, folded precisely, and pressed flat as if it had been stored with care. He handed it to me and said, "I believe this belongs to you." I took it. I did not know what to say. I still do not. As the shuttles lifted off, I watched the settlement from the viewport. The colonists were already moving back into their homes. Children were picking up toys from the floors where they had left them 21 days earlier. Smoke was rising from the community hall's chimney. Rent was standing at the perimeter fence, watching the shuttles climb. He was leaning on his bad knee and squinting against the engine wash, and from 500 meters of altitude he looked like what his file said he was, a 58-year-old mining foreman with a limp and a hearing aid. Nothing more. Nothing more. That is the phrase I keep returning to. Because everything I have described to you in this briefing, the evacuation, the surveillance, the snares, the demonstrations, the gorge, the psychological profiles, the operational analysis of my entire force, was accomplished by a man who looks like nothing more. He stood and walked to the door of the briefing room, stopped, turned back to face his officers. Before I filed the recommendation, I spent the night of day 21 walking the garrison perimeter alone. No sidearm, no communication device. The full circuit, 40 minutes, 2.5 kilometers. I wanted to see if I would be alone. "Were you?" Drevin asked. I counted 3 separate observations: a rustle of fabric that was not wind, a shadow that moved against the prevailing light, a smell, faint, organic, that drifted across my path and vanished. 3 observers at minimum. I suspect there were more, within arm's reach for portions of that walk. I will never know how many because I did not see them. He looked at each officer one last time. "The conclusion is this. We have been assessing humans as a technological civilization. We have measured their ships, their weapons, their infrastructure, their communication systems. We have ranked them on the same scales we use for every species in the Dominion's operational database, and every assessment we have produced is incomplete because it measures what humans build and ignores what humans are." He walked to the door. What humans are is a species of 3-million-year-old pursuit predators with a cognitive architecture built for tracking, reading, and outlasting anything in their environment. They do not need sensors because they are sensors. They do not need tactical networks because their brains are tactical networks. They do not need stealth technology because they have been hiding from and hunting things since before our species learned to use fire. Every human being, every farmer, every teacher, every child carries the full suite of pursuit predator cognition as standard equipment. It is not an upgrade. It is not a specialization. It is the default. He stopped at the door, turned back. "There is something else I need to tell you. Something that is not in the operational record because I did not report it. It happened on day 19, 3 days before the withdrawal." The officers waited. I was in the command post at 200, alone. The garrison was quiet. I was reviewing patrol reports, trying to find a pattern, any pattern that would tell me where the colonists were operating from. I had been at it for hours. The reports blurred together. I was exhausted. At some point I became aware that the temperature in the room had changed. Not dramatically. A slight shift, the kind of thing you notice when a door opens in another part of a building and the air pressure adjusts. I looked up from my datapad. The door to the command post was closed. The window was sealed. The ventilation was running on its standard cycle. Nothing had changed. But the temperature had shifted, and there was something else. A smell, faint, organic. The scent of someone who had been living outdoors, wood smoke, damp earth, the particular musk of human exertion. It was there for 3 seconds, maybe 4, and then it was gone. I drew my sidearm, checked the room. Every corner, every shadow, the space behind the equipment racks, the gap beneath the console desk. Nothing. I was alone. The room was empty. The door was locked from the inside. I sat back down. My hands were not steady. I put the sidearm on the desk, and I sat there for a long time, listening to the ventilation cycle and trying to decide whether I had imagined it. On the desk next to my datapad there was a small object that had not been there before. A stone, basalt, roughly the size of a closed fist, with the flat face up. On the flat face, scratched with a sharp tool, were 2 lines in Dominion trade script. The first line read, "You are working too late." The second line read, "The door on the west corridor has a faulty latch. Fix it before someone gets hurt." I checked the west corridor door the next morning. The latch was faulty. The maintenance log showed no prior report. Rent's people had identified a safety hazard in my own garrison that my own maintenance team had missed. Someone had been in my locked command post while I was sitting in it. They had entered, placed a stone on my desk, and left without me seeing them, hearing them, or detecting them in any way. The only evidence was a faint smell and a shift in temperature that lasted 3 seconds. He looked at his officers. That is when I stopped thinking of Rent as an adversary. That is when I started thinking of him as the most competent field commander I had ever encountered. Because a man who can put an operative inside a locked command post without the garrison commander noticing, and uses that capability to leave a maintenance recommendation, is not a man you can defeat. He is a man you negotiate with, and you count yourself fortunate that he prefers talking to killing. He straightened. Update the operational threat database. Reclassify all human assessments from technology-based to biology-based, and add a note to the Rithai's IV file. What note? Drevin asked. Note, the most dangerous trait observed is not lethality. It is the sustained preference for a non-lethal outcome achieved through superior observation. They could have killed us, every one of us, at any time. They chose not to, and they demonstrated the capability specifically to ensure we understood the choice. The restraint is not weakness. The restraint is the threat. Because a species that can reach you, touch you, and take things from your body without your knowledge, and consistently chooses to return what it takes, stacked neatly in a dry cave, is a species that has decided your survival is worth more than your defeat. And a species that makes that decision while holding every advantage is not an enemy you engage. It is an enemy you respect. He stepped through the door. The corridor was bright, clean, and quiet. His boots echoed on the polished floor, a sound that 3 months ago he would not have noticed. Now he heard it the way he imagined a human might hear it, as information, as a signature broadcast to anyone listening. Cadence, weight distribution, fatigue level, emotional state, all encoded in the simple act of walking. He walked slower, quieter. He was not sure when he had started doing that. Behind him in the briefing room, the officers sat in silence for a long time. Kesara eventually powered down the holographic display. Hareth left without speaking. Peleth sat with his hands on the table, staring at the surface as if it might contain messages he had not yet learned to read. Dreven was the last to move. He sat alone in the empty room, listening to the ventilation, the hum of the lighting panels, the distant sound of boots in the corridor. Sounds he had heard 1,000 times before and never thought about. Sounds that, after this briefing, he would never stop thinking about. He reached down to his sidearm's holster. The weapon was there. He drew it, checked the charge indicator. Full charge. No discrepancies, nothing missing. He holstered it, then he checked again. Still full, still intact, nothing taken. He sat there for another minute, unable to explain why that fact did not reassure him. Then he stood, straightened his uniform, and walked out of the briefing room into the bright, clean corridor. Halfway to his quarters he stopped, looked down. His bootlaces were tied in a knot he did not recognize.